Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed page where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor, best-selling author, and PhD in literature. Today we are diving into a genre called the campus novel, and more importantly, we are diving into one of my very, very favorite books by Vladimir Nabokov. The fact that we're talking today about a campus novel, though, is an excellent segue into really exciting news, which is that recently I have taken on a part-time faculty position, a professorship, at New Lane University. The idea behind New Lane is that everyone deserves access to an incredible college education, regardless of any sort of barriers, whether or not your schedule or whether or not your pocketbook is going to allow you to get that education. As I have gotten deeper and deeper into my experience with New Lane, it is getting more and more exciting. One of the things I'm doing is basically taking a few of the introductory courses so that I will be able to evaluate students' performance in those courses. And let me tell you, one of the first ones was called Exploring the Liberal Arts, and I literally was like, oh my god, this sounds awful. Like, why are they making someone take a class called Exploring the Liberal Arts? And then I was just blown away. What this is just this very rigorous defense of why a liberal arts education is amazing. The way that this course is laid out and the syllabus and all of the different aspects of it were so engaging and interesting. There's a lot of philosophy in there. There's a lot of history in there. Honestly, part of me is like, I think they need a new name for this class. But more importantly, I just was blown away. So if you are a reader of Nabokov, you would be so impressed at the rigor. One of the very best things for me is they didn't really have a literature department. They're kind of new. They just were internationally accredited last year. So I am getting essentially to build the literature department. And honestly, as I was reading Pnin, my thinking was like, we need an entire course where we're just going to read Pnin over and over and over from like different angles and from different, literary theory perspectives and through different lenses. We'll look at it a Marxist lens and not a feminist lens probably, but we'll be looking at it from all of these different angles. And then I realized that maybe we weren't going to just build an entire course around Pnin, but honestly, that is the kind of weight that this book has for me. If you are interested or you know anyone who is interested, come and study with me. I cannot guarantee that there will be an entire course on Pnin, but you can bet there are going to be some really interesting literature courses. Okay, but to dive into our very important novel for today, I say novel, it is almost a novella. It's a short novel. It reads very, very quickly, and in my mind, I always think it is a novella. In some level, I do like the idea of thinking of its length because it feels light, certainly compared to a book like Lolita, for example, which feels a little longer, a little denser, just a little more substantive. Pnin, in lots of ways, feels lighter, is definitely more optimistic, despite the incredible tones of tragedy. But because of its optimism and because of the fact that Pnin in many ways is so heroic, it's just an incredibly delightful book to dive into. So what we're going to do today is to take a look very briefly at Nabokov's biography. We're then going to dive into the title of the book. We're going to look at some of the prose in the very beginning. We're going to look at this book as a very important testament to what life is like as an immigrant. We're going to look at the narrator. This is one of the most fascinating narrators that Nabokov has come up with. And let me tell you, he has come up with many a fascinating narrator. We're going to look at the structure, just sort of the overall. It's very much a palindrome. It's a mirror-like thing that's happening in this novel. In many ways, it's a puzzle, which of course is another staple of what Nabokov is doing with fiction. We're going to look at the use of squirrels throughout, which is important, and then we're going to look at the close. So one of the things that I want to talk about briefly before we really dive in is something that I've been thinking about a lot today in particular. And this is the fact that in many ways, Lolita and Pnin were really happening for Nabokov right around the same time, which is kind of incredible. The parallels between these two books, while they seem completely unlikely, the parallels are so deep. Nabokov published Lolita in 1955 in Paris. He published it through the Olympia Press, which was kind of a racy kind of an imprint because no one else wanted to touch it. So that was in 1955. It didn't come out in the United States until 1958. It was written in English. And although everyone thinks of Nabokov as Russian, he certainly was Russian, but when he was growing up, he had an English governess and a French governess. And in fact, his English and French apparently, supposedly, were better than his Russian. So we think of English as being his third language, and in many ways that is kind of factual, but he also was exposed to English. Regardless, this is an incredible feat. But Lolita was published in 1958 in the United States. Pnin came out in 1957. Pnin was a huge hit. They had to reprint it twice, I believe within like the first, few weeks after it was published, and it has never been out of print. And I'm going to assume here that most of you have read both Pnin and Lolita. If you haven't, I'm not going to spoil anything for you, but I'm just going to touch on some of the parallels because they are so fascinating. Again, at first blush, these are works that don't seem that similar, and yet a lot of what they are doing is either kind of like identical or kind of the inverse. So in both cases, we have someone who is a Russian person who has emigrated to the United States and in many ways is kind of just trying to make sense of the United States. A lot of what both of these novels are doing are really like in-depth explorations of what it is to, not even so much to be American, but how American society functions, how American geography and lifestyle and living accommodations and driving, all of these things are real preoccupations in both of the novels. In both, we have someone who has a child. In the case of Humbert Humbert, he has a stepdaughter, which is disgusting what happens there. And in the case of Pnin, we have him with essentially what is a stepchild. It's really interesting to look at all of the scholarship. A lot of people are confused about the paternity situation with Pnin and Victor. And that confusion is obviously not happenstance. I mean, nothing in Nabokov is left to chance. So some people think that Liza is pregnant with Pnin's baby and then marries Eric Vind, but then other people think that in fact this child is Eric Vind's. Either way, we have this sense of real dedication on the part of Pnin toward Victor. Victor in many ways is much more successful than either of these father figures. But we have this very strong relationship. A lot of it is happening kind of, off stage in many ways throughout the novel. But we have this real dedication. And for me, one of the most deeply affecting scenes of the entire book is when Pnin is washing this beautiful punch bowl that Victor has sent to him. I have to say, I actually was reading that part. It was perhaps in one of my own darker moments. And I could not remember, this is my shitty memory, which is both good and bad. I could not remember whether or not the bowl breaks. And I honestly I was just like sure that it was going to break. Again, I think this is a darker moment. And I was so upset by the idea that while Pnin is washing this bowl that it is going to break, that I almost like had to skip to the end of the chapter and just move on to the next thing because it was going to be so gut-wrenching for me. And honestly, the relief that I felt when I realized that the bowl was going to remain intact was like, it was just incredible, which says an enormous amount. That really speaks to the ways that this is seen as a comic novel because in lots of ways Timofey Pnin is kind of a clownish figure, but it is also a book that is absolutely full of pathos. This is someone who is really suffering because everyone in his life, his first love, his wife, who is like not that awesome, all of his relatives, he's distanced from them both in terms of geography, but also because many of them were murdered during either the Russian Revolution or during the Second World War. But back to this idea of the parallels between the two. So in both of the books, we have a father figure and kind of an ambiguous relationship with a child that is not their biological child. In both of the books, we have these crazy narrative situations where we have a narrator who's kind of, it's not clear from the beginning who the narrator is, but in both cases, the narrator turns out to be a very important figure in the work. Both of them have like a one name title, which is so interesting because Lolita, obviously, it's one of the most kind of like notorious like titles of all time. It's so funny. People these days keep talking about notoriety as if it simply means fame. And it drives me insane because notoriety is like a bad thing. Like if something is notorious, it's like it's known for being a bad thing, for having some sort of like evil component. Which every time I get hung up on something like this, I just try to remind myself that language is evolving and that people are always being more efficient, but it is actually kind of driving me insane. Versus Pnin, which is a name and a title that really does evoke kind of the comic aspects of the novel. In both cases, cars and travel are a big deal. I mean, I feel like I could go on and on and on in terms of the parallels between the two, and it would be so fascinating. You know what? If I make a course on this over at New Lane University, you people can come and work with me, and someone can write an incredible paper. You don't actually have to write that many papers at New Lane, to be clear, but you could take it upon yourself to really do an in-depth study on the two of these, which would be fascinating. Okay, now we're going to back up a little bit though, and we're going to talk about Pnin. First of all, we'll talk about Nabokov, and then we're going to dive into the novel itself. So Vladimir Nabokov was born in 1899 in St. Petersburg, born into a very affluent family, again, had all sorts of governesses. His family was very wealthy, very liberal. And I have in my notes here, not only was there an English governess, but a lot of the fiction that Nabokov was reading when he was young, he loved Jack London, he loved the Western as a genre. So there is a pretty big exposure to the United States and also to the language of English. He fled Russia in 1917 during the Russian Revolution. His father was murdered. He was in Berlin for some time and then in Paris. He married a Jewish woman named Vera, and they emigrated in 1940 at the outbreak of what he called the Hitler War. So if they come to the United States in 1940, it's 17 years later, 1957, when he publishes Pnin. During that time, he teaches in a lot of different schools. He teaches at Wellesley, he teaches at Cornell, teaches at Stanford, which is interesting. I kind of don't picture him all the way out on the West Coast, but all you have to do is think of Humbert driving around the whole United States to imagine all the ways that Nabokov was making his way across this country. As I said before, Pnin was an instant critical success. Importantly, I think that paved the way. I don't know this for a fact, but if it came out in 1957 and Lolita came out in 58, you can imagine that the success of this small, short, kind of delightful, very intellectual and engaging novel, you can imagine that might have paved the way for American readers to understand what it is that Lolita is. Certainly it was a shocking story, but because of the absolute beauty and complexity and just the incredibly engaging and intricate nature of Pnin, I think maybe people might have been more ready to absorb all of those beautiful aspects of Lolita. So we're going to go ahead and dive into the text. The first thing I want to talk about is the title. If you are here at the Foxed page in order to get more out of your reading experience, to become a quote-unquote better reader, the advice, it's very basic. I say this practically every time. The advice is simply to slow down and pay more attention. And one thing that I think readers kind of gloss over is the title at times. I certainly do that with chapter titles. It's really bad. I'm just even though I know this about myself, I continue to just skip over chapter titles. I do make a pretty good point of really digging into the actual title of the book. In this case, it's really interesting. The original title of the book, the one that Nabokov originally wanted, was called My Poor Pnin. So those of you who are longtime Nabokov readers know that he's incredibly invested in wordplay. He loves puns. He loves alliteration. This is someone who is stretching language to its max. And the idea of My Poor Pnin, that kind of the doubling of the P sound there, it sounds kind of like spluttering. It's very much like the way that you might imagine Pnin himself speaking. The other thing about this, the proposed title, My Poor Pnin, it also spoke to the fact that in the original version, it was going to be much longer. And in the end, Pnin was going to die of a heart attack. So happily, that is not what happens at the end of the novel. And I like the idea, My Poor Pnin speaks to someone who would have died at the end. And it's a much more kind of tragic idea than the title being Pnin. Importantly also, My Poor Pnin really is a nod to this narrator. And we're going to talk about the narrator soon, but this is written in a very subtle way from the first person. There is a first person narrator who is actually also a character in the book. Most of you already know this. But I really do like the way that My Poor Pnin would have underscored the sense of there being this first-person narrator, because it would have tipped us off to this idea that we should be paying attention to that right from the very beginning. The other thing that's important about Pnin as a title is it's very difficult to pronounce. I listened to an entire podcast where at the beginning, this woman was like, I know it's supposed to be pronounced Pnin, but in my mind, I always said Pnin, so I'm just going to keep saying Pnin through the whole thing. And I literally had to stop listening because I was like, wait, he told you it's Pnin. What's up with this Pnin thing happening? But there's a much larger point to that. Anytime someone the stature of Nabokov is saying to you, or is giving you a title that is difficult to pronounce, you should not assume that that's just because he wants to punish you. It is because he is trying to destabilize the reader. The reader is not sure how to pronounce this, which is a very strange feeling. Happily, he tells us toward the beginning how we are meant to pronounce it. But part of that destabilization is because this is a word that should not be familiar to American readers. Part of what he's doing there is helping us understand the way that language, if you are someone who has emigrated from Russia, the language is in many ways very kind of hostile. I think that's maybe one of the words that he uses to describe the difficulties that Pnin himself has with a lot of English words. Literally, as I am saying that, I'm just remembering, I listened to this novel in part, but I would be just immersed in this novel, and I would be I honestly could read this book forever. It's 200 pages long. It is so incredibly rich. I'm imagining the part right now where Nabokov the narrator, is telling us about the difficulties that Pnin has with English. And I'm like, oh my God, I want to just look at that passage right now because it is like an absolute masterclass in, again, really like maxing out language. And when I say that, I simply mean like using language in all of these different very effective ways to show either the silliness of the English language or the contradictions of the English language or all the ways that language period is totally divorced from what it is actually symbolizing. Also, just then, when I was talking about the narrator and I said Nabokov, that is something we're going to discuss. But right from the start, we should be alerted to the fact that there is an invitation here to conflate the narrator and our author. Literally, the narrator's name, if you are carefully reading, is Vladimir Vladimirovich. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Vladimir is definitely, because he says at one point it's Vladimir like Redeemer. So you have Vladimir, and then I think it's Vladimirovich. I mean, that can't be right. But anyway, we hear during the part when they're at Cook's Castle, we hear there is a character of the name Vladimir. I just said it wrong, Vladimir. And that is one of these hallmarks, again, of Nabokov, is this idea of encouraging the reader to have to really play. A lot of this stuff is very ludic. It's very, it has to do with play. It has to do with childlike things. It has to do with games. In many ways, we're kind of sorting out all of the different ways that this is testing our idea of what fiction can do. And that idea of a game and having to interact with this as if it were a game is really, it's one of the ways that he is stretching not only language, but also the notion of what fiction is and what a novel is and what the role of the author is. It's just, I mean, again, I think most of you who are fans of Nabokov do not need me to underscore how incredibly engaging the language is, but also it's interesting to think not just like on the level of words themselves and of their sounds and of all of the different nuance, but also these bigger ways that when he's playing with narrative stance or with structure, that he's really pushing us in incredibly heady and interesting and intellectual ways to think about what it is that we are actually holding in our hands. So in terms of title, we have this foreign feeling about it, this idea that it's not easy to pronounce and that should, like destabilize the reader a little bit. But the other thing that it should be doing is making sure that we are focusing all of our attention on this man. This is the story of a man. It's a story of an individual with, for example, with Lolita, which I think we're going to be ping-ponging back and forth there throughout this entire lecture, apparently. With Lolita, we have this idea of the focus clearly being on this girl, which is harrowing but important. In this case, we're really focusing on this man. And in some ways, I think that allows us to see him both as clownish, but also as this very heroic figure. So we're going to take a look at the opening of the novel here. This is chapter 1. The elderly passenger sitting on the north window side of that inexorably moving railway coach next to an empty seat and facing 2 empty ones, was none other than Professor Timofey Pnin. Okay, a couple of different things. First of all, he's called elderly. We find out on the next page that he is 52, but and I guess that's kind of elderly, but in many ways he feels incredibly youthful, and part of that is because he has this kind of like boyish, kind of clownish thing about him. He also is someone who is not weighed down by family. He is someone who's a little head in the clouds, and he is someone who is perpetually engaged with this idea of the past. So it's a little startling. I mean, it's always so interesting to me to go back and look at the beginning of something after I have just finished reading it, because he doesn't feel elderly, and yet there is a world weariness here. I mean, this is someone who has experienced an enormous amount. We hear later about his exile and about living in these different European capitals and coming to the United States, and he's also someone who's just very tired. Life has not been easy for this man. So we have him as elderly. We also have him as a passenger. This is someone who is sitting on a railway car and it is inexorably moving. There's nothing he can do about this. He's on, I mean, this like should be heavy-handed, although it ends up not feeling heavy-handed. I mean, if you have someone on a train track at all and someone is on a train that's moving in a certain direction, you should absolutely question whether or not that person has any free will and whether that person is like, has a fate that they cannot escape. I mean, in this case, that in some ways, I feel like Pnin does kind of like elude fate, and he does kind of take matters into his own hand at the end, which is part of the heroic aspect. And in fact, I'm going to talk a little bit about the beginning and ending of the novel. At the end of the novel, he is driving off. He has decided that he does not want to have anything to do with our narrator. He is taking his life into his own hands, and he is driving away in a car. So he has this car that he purchased from someone else. He owns the car. He knows, he passed his driver's test. He knows how to drive. He's not a great driver, but he's driving off, and we don't know where he's going. I don't get the sense that he's driving off into like some radically successful life that is ahead of him, but you do have the sense that he is in control, and that is very different than this idea of him being a simple passenger, a very passive passenger on this inexorably moving train. We also, there's like a little bit of a, throughout all of Nabokov, you have a little bit of like a rarefied thing. Like a railway coach to me sounds not, I think like in like American parlance, you would just say on this moving train. The railway coach, there's a certain way that there's a European flavor to a lot of the language that feels very much rarefied and elevated, and someone who is not American in a way that feels to me like it adds on a very subtle level, it adds a huge amount to our understanding of Pnin. So very notably also and tragically, he's sitting next to an empty seat and across from two other empty seats. This is an entire, the whole book, it is so full of pathos. It's pathos in the sense of like deep yearning and sadness. And a lot of that pathos comes from being lonely. I mean, this is someone who is profoundly, profoundly alone. He's in contact with all sorts of people as he moves through this book, and yet we never really see him connecting deeply with anyone in his orbit. We see him connecting with some people in the past, but sort of, but like really he is someone who is profoundly alone. So as we're moving toward the end of this sentence, we have, he's by himself, and then we have this, he was none other than Professor Timofey Pnin. So none other than is this kind of elevation of him, and it's important to know that we have like a narrator here who is in opposition and in competition with Pnin, and who thinks Pnin is kind of a ridiculous clown, because what we have him doing here, I mean, at this point, we don't know that we have this kind of rarefied narrator who is a person in the story. But when we go back and look at it, we can appreciate that there's a little tongue in cheek here. He's like, oh, it's none other than the professor, blah, blah, blah. We have this idea of none other than as elevating him. And as soon as he has elevated him, we have him made into a clown. So this is after we have Timofey Pnin, we have this. Ideally bald, suntanned, and clean-shaven, he began rather impressively with that great brown dome of his, tortoiseshell glasses, masking an infantile absence of eyebrows, apish upper lip, thick neck, and strong-man torso in a tightish tweed coat, but ended, somewhat disappointingly, in a pair of spindly legs, now flannelled and crossed, and frail-looking, almost feminine feet. I mean, there at the end, we have lots of alliteration there with this flanneled and frail-looking feminine feet, which again, Nabokov being a big fan of alliteration. But this description, we have emphasis here on like the largeness of his head, and in many ways that's meant to like alert us to the fact that he is someone who is an academic. But then we also have this idea of the infantile, like lacking eyebrows, and we're speaking there to a youthfulness, not even a youthfulness, but like he, in many ways, he is an infant. He does not understand the world around himself. He does not do well with like physical objects and mechanical things, but he also is just he's very much like a baby in lots of ways, and that is told to us right at the very start. Even with the baldness, it ends up feeling very like fetal. We also, of course, have this idea of him as being somewhat feminine. He's kind of top-heavy with this head and then goes down to these feminine feet. So there is this idea of emasculation, and in many ways, the narrator like comes across as having a very confident, very strong, very charming, like literally the opposite of Pnin in all sorts of different ways. And you do get the sense, I mean, poor Pnin is just like absolutely neutered by his wife, who he ends up marrying. And we find out in these subtle digressions that in fact our narrator at one point was also interested in Liza. So at every turn, we have Pnin as being sort of lesser than, and as being like someone, again, who's sort of feminine and sort of infantile. But in many ways, it's all the more striking then when we are really concerned for him. He's a deeply sympathetic character, even though he's kind of a goofy, clownish, kind of baby-like figure at the start. And importantly, on the very next page, we have a couple paragraphs in the beginning, but then we have the first full page. And right away, we are introduced to his emigre status. So he's described with these feminine feet. And we have this part here right up at the top of the second page. Prior to the 1940s, during the staid European era of his life, he had always worn long underwear. So then he goes on, and there's like a little description of his long underwear and how he always tucked them into his socks. But the important thing here is this idea that he had this staid European era in his life. It's introduced right from the very beginning. It's also speaking to the ways that he's very modest. He also doesn't understand like American culture in lots of ways. He feels naked if his shin is showing, which is, that's a very like Victorian, English kind of thing, although it would have been a woman who would have felt that way, which again speaks to like this feminine side of him. So, but then down a little further, we have this idea of his time in the United States and on campuses in particular. He's a teacher of Russian, as being as like really being fortified in many ways. So on the bottom of 8, we have, or not the bottom, it's like the middle of page 8, the second page of the book, we have this. All this underwent a change in the heady atmosphere of the New World. Nowadays, at 52, he was crazy about sunbathing, wore sports shirts and slacks, and when crossing his legs would carefully, deliberately, brazenly display a tremendous stretch of bare shin. So this is amazing to me. It's also reminding me that Humbert Humbert was a big fan of sunbathing. Apparently all these guys were into sunbathing. So, and there is something about that. Whenever you have like something that you're noticing in literature, it's important to ask, so what? And in many ways, it really speaks to this idea of being in a place where the climate is more friendly, more adaptable, and more comfortable, but also the idea of some of the freedoms. It's interesting too, New World there is capitalized. So you have this sense of European, like staidness of the old world and then the new world. So very importantly, this is not something we're going to lean into today. Although when I teach Pnin at my course that I'm going to teach at New Lane, we will definitely be talking about satire. This is a book that is a hugely important satire of the American campus and also of American culture in general. So when we have here the idea that he was crazy about sunbathing, even the way that the language, like clearly that is our narrator who is imitating some like overly enthusiastic American who's saying, oh, he was crazy for sunbathing. So you have this idea of the parlance as like a send up of the way that Americans would have been speaking, and even the idea of sunbathing at the time as being kind of a craze. It's easiest to see this book as a satire when you do look at the campus. So one of the things toward the end, like the reason that Timofey has to leave in part is because he speaks Russian too well, and he won't be able to teach Russian if he speaks it well, because there's this whole conceit about how the French professor like has no French, and that's important. And you can, as the French professor, you never want to be more than one lesson ahead of your students. In fact, some of the like send up of the ridiculousness of the like language departments in colleges, some of that felt to me like a little heavy-handed. I cannot believe I am saying anything that's like anti-Nabokov at all. And it's very funny the way that he does it. But when you step back and look at that simple fact, that these professors, like even the way that they're conceiving of academia is so ridiculous that it seems a tiny bit over the top. But the satire of American culture and of the campus itself it just cannot be underscored enough. As we move through, we'll be looking at these satirical elements. And I want to look here at the very beginning at the our very first moment when we hear our narrator. And it's very subtle what is happening here, but it's very important. So we have this description of him where he would like maybe brazenly show part of a shin, and then we have this. Thus he might have appeared to a fellow passenger, but except for a soldier asleep at one end and 2 women absorbed in a baby at the other, Pnin had the coach to himself. So with the soldier there, we have the specter and like the shadow of war, which is, kind of over everything in all of Nabokov. And we have the idea of these 2 women and a baby. We have this idea of the infantile here, and also women who are not paying any attention to him. Also women who are, together by themselves. They are not, almost never do we see a really stable and good image of what marriage is like in this book. So it's really underscoring his loneliness. So we have this idea of Pnin had the coach to himself, and then we have this, which is crucial. Now a secret must be imparted. Professor Pnin was on the wrong train. So this idea of like, this is very subtle, and we don't know here that we are going to have a narrator who is going to be an important player in the book. But this idea of now an important secret must be imparted, we have this idea that someone knows the secret and someone is going to tell us the secret. So the idea of constructing it that way, now an important secret must be revealed, we get the sense that there is an entity, like someone's playing with this idea of who has the knowledge in this book. So we have the introduction of this narrator, and then within this very first chapter, we have like this beautiful arc where we're really having so much information. We have the idea of the description of him. We know that he's on this train. We have this background information that he had been in Europe and like this staid, European chapter after the revolution. And then we have him now in the United States. Then we have the subtle introduction of the narrator. I mean, this is all happening like so subtly, but it's so dense and so rich. And then we're only on page 13, so we're only like 6 pages into the book, and we have this description that is one of the ways that we are starting to see him as a really heroic figure. He is someone who almost at every turn, I mean, he's awkward at every turn for sure, but he's also just like so appealing and so good-natured. And in many ways, what he is giving his students is this beautiful visions of what Russia is like through Russian literature. There are lots of different names here of all of these different Russian, poets and different Russian writers, and really, as a professor, like he's not doing a great job of teaching Russian, but it's so appealing what he is doing. Typical Nabokov, we have like this whole discussion of like what it is that he is actually reading to them. Sometimes it's like high class kind of like poetry stuff. Sometimes it's very like, everyman kind of writing. And in many cases, like the students are not super, like, it's not that he's giving them a really accurate view of what this Russian is all about. You can imagine a lot of it is lost in translation, but there's a certain delight that he is giving his students that is so powerful. And then we have this. Directing his memory, with all the lights on and all the masks of the mind a miming, toward the days of his fervid and receptive youth, in a brilliant cosmos that seemed all the fresher for having been abolished by one blow of history, Pnin would get drunk on his private wines as he produced sample after sample of what his listeners politely surmised was Russian humor. Presently, the fun would become too much for him. Pear-shaped tears would trickle down his tanned cheeks. Not only his shocking teeth, but also an astonishing amount of pink upper gum tissue would suddenly pop out. And although the speech he smothered behind his dancing hand was now doubly unintelligible to the class, his complete surrender to his own merriment would prove irresistible. By the time he was helpless with it, he would have his students in stitches, with abrupt barks of clockwork hilarity coming from Charles, and a dazzling flow of unsuspected lovely laughter transfiguring Josephine, who was not pretty, while Aileen, who was, dissolved into a jelly of unbecoming giggles. So we have this incredible description of like his mirth. I mean, it is mixed with sadness. At first, when the tears are rolling down, you're like, uh-oh, like is he sad about what he's reading here? And of course, all of this for him is a mixture of both nostalgia and sadness, but also of mirth and of humor. So we have this description of him as being in some ways a not very effective professor, and in other ways being very effective just in terms of emotion and eliciting emotion. And then we have this idea of the giggles, and then we have this. All of which does not alter the fact that Pnin was on the wrong train. And then we move on to this question: how should we diagnose his sad case? And then we go on, and he's this narrator is telling us a little bit more about his like stature as a professor. But what's important there is we have this idea of we, the second person plural, meaning that the narrator is drawing the reader in and saying like, how are we, author and reader, narrator and reader, how are we to understand Pnin? It's such a just incredible masterclass. Again, this is like 7 pages into the novel, and we have such a gigantic like breadth in terms of who this person is and how the novel is going to function. So we have a couple of other intrusions by our narrator as we're moving along, and there's more about this question of him being on the wrong train, and then all of this kind of like slapsticky kind of stuff ensues. And the train that he is on, he is moving to like basically give a lecture in Cremona College to basically what's like a group of women who are gathering at night. I say that in kind of a derogatory way just because these are not women who are like scholastic people. These are, it's like almost like a garden club who's getting together to listen to this professor, which of course speaks to the fact that he is not really very well appreciated. And that is important, of course, the kind of clownishness of him and the satire of the idea of, women's clubs and organizing themselves and hearing important lectures, and the idea just of the American campus. But then at the end of this first chapter, we have this absolutely just gut-wrenching description of Pnin as someone who is an emigre and someone who has had just like this terrible tragedy befall him. So on 27, we have this. He's about to give his lecture, and she's going to introduce him, and then she's like, we're going to listen to Professor Pnin. She can't pronounce his name, of course, at first. And then she's like, and next week we're going to have this amazing woman, and she starts talking about this other woman. So we have our introducing person at the lecture who is digressing in a way. Everyone in this book is constantly digressing, but in a way that is a total slight to Pnin. So we have him sitting there while the introducer is going on and on about the person who's coming next week. And we have this kind of meditation that's a description on the part of our narrator, but this is one of those ways that, and this is important, it's one of the ways that the narrator, like there's no way the narrator could know this. This is one of those times when our narrator, and this happens all the time, our narrator is sliding into the thoughts and the feelings of Pnin. It's very important. It's like Gatsby. It's very important to know that we have a first person narrator, but it's very fluid and it's often moving into this third person. And it's also knowing all sorts of things that there's no way that, this competitive colleague who is also a Russian emigre could ever know about Pnin. So on page 27, we have this description of the introducing at the lecture. And importantly, Pnin has just had this kind of crisis, like almost like a seizure kind of a thing that has everything to do with feeling like this deep sense of nostalgia and this deep sense of horror at what has befallen him. So on 27, we have this. But Pnin was not listening. A faint ripple stemming from his recent seizure was holding his fascinated attention. It lasted only a few heartbeats, with an additional systole here and there, last, harmless echoes, and was resolved in demure reality as his distinguished hostess invited him up to the lectern. But while it lasted, how limpid the vision was. In the middle of the front row of seats, he saw one of his Baltic aunts, wearing the pearls and the lace and the blonde wig she had worn at all the performances given by the great ham actor Kodatov, whom she had adored from afar before drifting into insanity. Next to her, shyly smiling, sleek dark head inclined, gentle brown gaze shining up at Pnin from under velvet eyebrows, sat a dead sweetheart of his, fanning herself with a program. Murdered, forgotten, unrevenged, incorrupt, immortal, many old friends were scattered throughout the dim hall among the more recent people, such as Miss Clyde, who had modestly regained a front seat. Vanya Bednyashkin, shot by the Reds in 1919 in Odessa because his father had been a liberal, was gaily signaling to his former schoolmate from the back of the hall. And in an inconspicuous situation, Dr. Pavel Pnin and his anxious wife, both a little blurred, but on the whole wonderfully recovered from their obscure dissolution, looked at their son with the same life-consuming passion and pride that they had looked at him with that night in 1912 when, at a school festival, commemorating Napoleon's defeat, he had recited, a bespectacled lad all alone on the stage, a poem by Pushkin. The brief vision was gone. Old Miss Herring, retired professor of history, author of Russia Awakes, 1922, was bending across one or two intermediate members of the audience to compliment Miss Clyde on her speech, while from behind that lady, another twinkling old party was thrusting into her field of vision a pair of withered, soundlessly clapping hands. It's so brutal. I mean, this is so one of the important things that's happening here is the love, this young woman who we have like alluded to here. It turns out she is someone who is killed in one of the concentration camps, and we hear much about her later. But we have this idea, we have his like a childhood friend, we have his parents, we have an aunt, we have this like childhood love or like young love. All of these people have amassed together in just this absolutely harrowing thing. There's something about like him being a child and his parents looking on that's particularly like just sympathy provoking. It's just an absolutely incredible, like, virtuoso performance of like all the sorrows of what it would be like to be an emigre. He's so lonely, and he is alone, and he's with all of these people who do not understand him and do not appreciate him when he came, from this very rich society in terms of connections with other people, but also in terms of art and literature and like society, all of these different things that he really held dear that are brought to the fore here by Nabokov. It's amazing too that then we have this satire right away of this woman who is an American who wrote Russia Awakes and 1922, and you have this sense of like Americans not understanding at all what had happened for these people who had emigrated from Russia. So just to recap, what we have here in the first chapter, I mean, the first, less than 30 pages of the novel, 25 pages of the novel, is just, it's an incredible way that we are setting up all of these different aspects that are going to be developed as we move through the work. Okay, now that we've looked at the prose a little bit more closely in some of these circumstances, we're going to move a tiny bit more quickly to talk about some of these other aspects of the novel. One is this idea of the historical context. So Nabokov often will talk about history, Russian history or European history, the Hitler War as he referred to it, in these kind of oblique, kind of fable-like kind of ways, like the soldier on the train, a bunch of different kind of allusions to war. But in Pnin here, we have a couple of times where he talks very specifically, like on page 27, which we just read, that one of Vanya was shot by the Reds in 1919 in Odessa because his father had been a liberal. So we have this idea of very specific things being mentioned. And we have, at one point, like Timofey's father is one of Dostoevsky's doctors. And that's, I mean, obviously just tip of the iceberg. We have all of these different circumstances where real historical events and real people are being mentioned in what is a fictive work. So the importance of that is, again, really stretching this idea of what fiction can do, but it is really anchoring us in the reality of the situation. I mean, this is, we just read what is a very deeply affecting like sense of one man's experience of the Russian Revolution, and this idea of like what it would be like to have most of your family murdered and then have to move to Europe and then have to move to the United States, the loneliness and the sadness, and this idea of these people as being murdered, forgotten, unrevenged, incorrupt, and immortal. All of these people, it's, you have one man's experience of it, which of course allows us to understand the difficulty in that experience, but it is deeply rooted in historical like fact, which really adds to the power of this short novel. Another way that is happening, I mean, these are very much kind of similar aspects. You have actual, like, historical events that are being noted, but you also have this kind of actual presence of someone whose name is Vladimir Vladimirovich. That is 100% not correct. Vladimir, I'm not even going to try it. I would look it up, but that would take too long for me. You have this person who Pnin knew in Russia, who has now also emigrated and who is basically in competition for this place at Wendell. And that narrator is Vladimir. So you have this idea of it as being, it's an invitation to conflate the narrator with our author. So you have this idea of the author, who is a real person, as kind of stepping into the novel, which is really important. And again, the importance of that is to give a little more gravitas, a little more weight to this thing. This novel is describing actual like experiences that have happened for actual people in a way that is vivid and playful and interesting and engaging. And it's one of the most effective ways you can imagine, a description in a history book about the Reds, in Odessa in 1919 that would have far less impact than when we have it here in this piece of fiction. So speaking of the narrator, I just wanted to make a couple of other comments about that. So in the beginning, we have these very subtle things like a secret must be imparted. And we have, like, that's not even first person, but we have this sense of there being a force that is the narrator, that's an actual person. And then we have the we, which is very subtle. And then it becomes more and more first person as we move through. We get to a chapter toward the end where it begins like my first impression of Timofey Pnin, where it really is told from the first person, but much like in Lolita, the introduction of this narrator, who is a character, is very subtle. And there is, for people who are kind of hung up on this idea of like, how could Vladimir have known all of this stuff about Pnin? Much like in Gatsby, there are all these different times, well, not all these different times, but there are 4 or 5 different times where the narrator says things like, Pnin used to say that blah, 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 or a relative of mine, and this is a woman at the consulate. So we have this idea of our narrator as having gathered all of this information. And in some ways, it doesn't matter because if you're Nabokov, you can break all the rules you want and you can have like this very subtle first person narrator. But there's also this incredible care that gives us a lot of credence that this person that this narrator does have all of this information because they are all part of the same emigre circles. I mean, it would not be an interesting book at all if he had to like, if it were only what this Vladimir character actually knew. But the fact that we have this grounding in reality, which is the actual person, which is the author, really does, it really does add some weight to the whole idea of like what fiction can do. It makes it, in fact, feel much more real in important ways. So I mentioned that we were going to discuss the structure, which I also want to walk through very quickly. One of the lectures, not lecture, one of the podcasts that I listened to about Nabokov in general was talking about how like all of the puzzles that he sets up for readers to explore and all of the different kind of subtle things that he is doing, it's a way for readers to have to keep engaging with the work. And this person's contention was that that was kind of his bid for immortality, that like as long as you had to keep working out these subtle little things, that it would keep you involved and people would be looking at his work forever. I'm not sure that you need to do that. I don't necessarily know that I need to have all of these things, like these little puzzles in order, and like details and nuances. I don't need all of that stuff in order for this to be so engaging, but it does add to the richness. I mean, again, I have read this book many times, and when I read it this past time, it again just felt like an absolute revelation. It was so rich and there was so much to it that I was like, I have to do an entire course on this one, 200-page book. But part of that is the structure. And again, it's very much like a palindrome being, a word that like, how would you, like, Madam, I am Adam, where you have, it, I don't even know how to describe that. The center is like a mirror and it goes in the same direction on either side. That does not make sense. I think most of you, you know what, if you don't know what a palindrome is, you're gonna have to look it up on like the internet and figure it out because I do not have a good description for it. Although this might help you. So in the first chapter, we have him on the train. He's going to deliver this lecture. Then we see him settled in at Waynedale. The description of what's happening with the Clemens family is so funny to me because their daughter Isabel, like her marriage isn't working out, and all of that stuff is so subtle. And Pnin is kind of oblivious to it. But the like intricacies, it's very like lightly sketched. But you have the whole entire idea. I mean, if you didn't pick up on that, that's worth rereading right there. The Clemens daughter is going through all this marital strife, and all of these different things are happening that you, as the reader, have to surmise. And Timofey is not picking up on any of it, which is very flattering to the reader. In lots of ways, we're like aligned with the narrator, that use of we right at the beginning. So we have this idea of him being with the Clemens family, but also that's a real underscoring of exile. He's with a family, and yet he doesn't feel at home. The house is drafty. He has all of these different sounds that are keeping him up. He can't figure out like a lot of the ways that the things are working in the house, but there's like that beautiful childlike thing where he loves watching things move around in the washer. So we have him in the train at the beginning, and then we have him established in someone's home. Interestingly, he never stays in one. He's like lives in like 10 different places. He's moving around all around the campus in a way that it's also very much like Lolita when we have Humbert moving from motel to motel all over the United States. It's this sense of that even in exile, even within the campus, he's never at rest. He's never comfortable. He's always on the move because kind of like nothing feels quite right for him. So we have him on the train to Cremona. Then we have him in other places on the campus. But the center chapter is chapter 4. There are 7 chapters. The 4th chapter is when Victor comes. And this is very important. Often, if a writer is worth their salt, something important will happen right at the center of the book. I think you all know that thing called the Freytag triangle, which is where it's like a way to describe plot, where we have an inciting incident, we have rising action, we have a climax, we have falling action, and then the denouement, which is just like, the kind of aftermath. But also, oftentimes you'll have something happen at the center of the novel that is really significant. Pnin, this book for the most part, does not have a lot of plot, but a lot is happening. There are tons of digressions, there are tons of really important evocations of exile, lots of send-ups of different, things that are happening on campus. But Victor arriving is one of the most important ones. It's really important that that chapter is told from the perspective of Victor. It's third person, but he has that beautiful thing about, like, he's imagining that his father is a king, which of course is underscoring all the ways in which Pnin is not a king. Neither is his potential father, Eric Vind, who's now down in like Panama or somewhere in South America, sitting on a bench, not having any thoughts about his child. So this is a child who, even though he is not someone who had to flee a country that was in revolution, he still is someone who is adrift. Even as a child of emigres, nothing is stable for him. He's in a boarding school. His father, neither of his father figures really cares about him. His mother doesn't care. She's going to remarry later. He has a very unstable life. And yet Victor is someone he has this vivid imagination, and he has all of this potential. In all the ways that Pnin falls short, Victor has like a lot of potential. So he's someone who is very smart. He's ahead of his class, but there are lots of ways that we have both sympathy and concerns about him. It's so poignant in many ways when Pnin gives him the soccer ball. It's something that he's not interested in at all. And he gives them the book that's not interesting to him. So they're kind of missing, even though they're making a lot of efforts. And then it's doubly beautiful when young Victor sends that beautiful punch bowl to Pnin, and everyone is admiring it. And it's like this really like incredibly generous gift that reflects that Victor feels a lot for Pnin. So the idea of this introduction of this kid right in the middle of the book is very important. In chapter 5, we have Pnin going to Cook's castle for the summer. He's spending the summer with all of these Russian emigres. And in many ways, that Cook's castle area is kind of like another campus. So he's in another community where he fits in some ways, but in other ways does not. He's, again, kind of a buffoon. He does not have a wife. He's not charming. There are all sorts of different ways that he feels like an outsider there. And the fact that he doesn't have a wife is really underscored by this idea of Mira. This is when we have his childhood love, the one who is mentioned in the very beginning during the lecture. We have like the tragedy of Mira really come to the fore. In chapter 6, we have this housewarming party. It's so tragic, where Pnin is wanting to buy the house on Todd Road. I have a brother named Todd, and I did so much thinking about what Todd would have meant in that context, like why it would have been Todd Road. And I really didn't come up with much. It's also, I think it's 999 Todd Road, so you do get the sense that you're at the very end of something. It's also right at a cliff. There are lots of ways in which the house itself is like doesn't have good omens. And sure enough, Pnin does not succeed in purchasing this home. But we have this idea of him kind of jumping the gun and having this housewarming party for everyone when we, as readers, know that he is about to be fired. Then we end with this idea of the way that Vladimirovich, maybe that was right. I might have gotten it right that time. But our narrator has, in this first person thing at the end, in this last chapter, is describing Pnin again. So we have the presence of the narrator kind of throughout, but he comes more into focus at the end. And it's really great because in many ways, Pnin is kind of taking on his own agency at the end. Again, he's driving. He is not going to work with this person. He wants nothing to do with it. And so you see him really, in some ways, kind of coming into his own. It's not super auspicious. We don't know where he's going. We get the sense he doesn't even know where he's going. And everything in his life has been so tragic that we don't think that suddenly there's going to be a major reversal and he's going to be happy forever. But you do have this sense of things as ending on this very optimistic note. Okay, and then another way that the book is structured, that's kind of just like in terms of the way the chapters work, but there's also the presence of the squirrel. So a motif is something in literature, in this case, the squirrel is a motif. The squirrels are prominent throughout the entire novel. And this is one of the most rewarding things to be paying attention to as you are moving through. So there are a bunch of different ways that squirrels are functioning. I think, at first when I was like sussing out what was happening here, I wanted all of the squirrels to be like one thing, and I don't think they are. In many ways, Pnin himself is described as a squirrel. There's a time when he's very young and he has that fever and he's looking at the screen in his room and he sees the squirrel eating something and he can't figure out what it is that the squirrel is holding. When he's sitting on the bench on the campus later and he sees this squirrel and it is holding a peach stone, we have this sense of like squirrels as being like totemic kind of creatures. They're like bringing him back to his childhood, but also helping him resolve certain things and have closure about certain things. So we have the idea of a squirrel as being very healing. There's one point when he understands that what the squirrel wants is that it's very thirsty. He just has this sense of being able to communicate. And while he is turning on the water for the squirrel in the water fountain, he himself is crying and crying and crying. So you have him that his tears are falling and the squirrel is being replenished. So you have this idea in some ways of like the squirrel as being kind of like his doppelganger. There are ways that it's like his animal familiar. There's also at one point and when a squirrel is up in the tree scolding. So you have this idea of squirrels as being kind of like conscience, so you have this sense of them as like putting him like, steering him in terms of what he is doing and how he is looking at things in terms of morality. You also have this idea, and this is like if you're picking up on the squirrel thing, and then Nabokov tells you what squirrel means, then you need to pay attention to that. So squirrel means shadow tail, and there's a part. I mean, we definitely have the sense that Pnin is being shadowed. He's being followed around campus or followed around the United States by this guy who wants to have his position in academia. The guy who is also the narrator of the book. So you have this idea of him as being shadowed and tailed also, like if you have a tail, like in terms of like private investigator speech, means that someone is following you. So you have this idea of him having both a shadow and a tail. And then there's that part where there's a shadow behind his heart. So you have this idea of squirrels as being related to him. And then there's this very like beautiful thing where we find out that one of his father's colleagues was Dr. Belochkin. And Belochkin means little squirrel. So it turns out that Mira Belochkin, who was his childhood love, Mira's last name means little squirrel. So in many ways, we are also meant to read all of these, not all of them, read some of the squirrels as a stand-in for Mira, and in many ways as for her absence. When we're seeing these squirrels, we are not seeing Mira. She is no longer in the world in any kind of like, I mean, maybe you could believe that she is like reanimated as these squirrels, not directly. I mean, I do not think that's what Nabokov is saying, but there's a sense of her energy and her spirit maybe as continuing on in these animals. But she, for all intents and purposes here, for our protagonist, is no longer in his world and his life. So it's important when we see something like a motif or any of these kind of literary constructions to ask ourselves, so what? And one of the same interview or the same podcast I was listening to, the guy was talking about how his sense of these little squirrels is that they're these kind of angelic figures, and that it's evidence of there being some kind of order, like that there is some kind of force that is kind of organizing his life, and like some sort of like godlike manifestation of order, and like that the world isn't chaos because you have this kind of subtle force of nature that's kind of either revealing things for Pnin or consoling him or reminding him of his past. I myself did not read that so much as like squirrel as guardian angel, as like, benevolent godlike force. That wasn't really how I saw it, which honestly is like a beautiful thing about reading a book. Everyone has their own interpretation. Some, of course, I think are more valid than others. For me, what that did, the like presence of the squirrel spoke to the power of fiction. So again, if we read about, the Russian Revolution and the experience of being an emigre in a history textbook, it would not be anything like this. So there's a way that the idea of these squirrels, because we are asked to engage with them and try to figure out what they are and try to think about, first of all, why is Pnin crying? But at every turn, when we are engaging with them, it's asking us to think about things a little differently and to stretch our sense of what it is that Pnin is going through and what it is that Nabokov is saying about the experience of being an emigre. So the idea of the squirrels all throughout, it's obviously a very important part of the novel and one that we could talk about for hours and hours. Okay, in closing here, I want to take a look at two passages. One is this, what for me is the most affecting scene of the whole entire novel, which is about the punch bowl. And then we're going to look at the very end of the book. And I'm not going to do lots of analysis, at least if I can control myself, but I'm just going to read through so you can really feel the like weight of the emotion and also just the gorgeousness of this prose. And it's absolutely crucial to remember that he has just found out from his like not his benefactor, but like Dr. Hagen is the guy in the German department who's like the head of the department that Pnin has been operating in because they don't have a Slavic languages department. So this is someone who's been looking out for him, and it's someone who now has just told him that he will be fired because Pnin wants to buy this house, and Dr. Hagen's like, oh gosh, let's not let him do that. So we have this sense here of just absolute despair because because Pnin thought he was having a housewarming and he thought he was finally settling in somewhere and putting down some roots as an emigre, and then realizes, in fact, that he does not have that job. So on 171, we have him doing the washing up after his party that has been a success, which is also sad. We have him doing the washing up, and he is putting this gorgeous bowl that everyone has admired. He's going to wash it. He prepared a bubble bath in the sink for the crockery, glass, and silverware, and with infinite care lowered the aquamarine bowl into the tepid foam. A little further down. He groped under the bubbles, around the goblets, and under the melodious bowl for any piece of forgotten silver, and retrieved a nutcracker. Fastidious Pnin rinsed it and was wiping it when the leggy thing somehow slipped out of the towel and fell like a man from a roof. He almost caught it. His fingertips actually came into contact with it in midair, but this only helped to propel it into the treasure-concealing foam of the sink, where an excruciating crack of broken glass followed upon the plunge. Which, of course, you are expecting the worst here. Pnin hurled the towel into a corner and, turning away, stood for a moment staring at the blackness beyond the threshold of the open back door. A quiet, lacy-winged little green insect circled in the glare of the strong, naked lamp above Pnin's glossy bald head. He looked very old, with his toothless mouth half open and a film of tears dimming his blank, unblinking eyes. Then, with a moan of anguished anticipation, he went back to the sink and, bracing himself, dipped his hand deep into the foam. A jagger of glass stung him. Gently, he removed a broken goblet. The beautiful bowl was intact. He took a fresh dish towel and went on with his household work. Oh my goodness. I mean, this is like, it's such an interesting thing because there's this near tragedy and it is going to be so awful. And then it's not. And you're like, oh my God, thank God. But then you're like, wait, the thing that he has that is so important to him is a gift that's given to him by a boy who he hardly ever sees. He has no family. He has to leave. He doesn't have a job. He can't buy this house. It's like he's escaping this one tragedy. And then you're remembering that in fact, his life is still very bleak. So it is very generous that Nabokov does, in fact, allow us to end on what is a more optimistic note. So now we're going to read the very ending of this book. And this is when we have our narrator. This is the whole last chapter. The 7th chapter is told in the first person. So it is Vladimir who's telling us this story. So in the first person, we have him. He's staying overnight with a professor there at Wendell because he's going to be in the English department, which is significant. Poor Pnin, he was going to be like foundering in the Slavic arm of the German department. And actually, Vladimir does say, I can make room for you in the university. And Pnin says he will not, in fact, work with this Vladimir character, which really is important. And it really both adds to sort of the nefarious kind of feel that we have about this guy, but also to just the goodness of Pnin. And it's interesting, I don't even know exactly where all of that kind of negative energy about the narrator comes. And, maybe it's as simple as all of the kind of satirical things and all the ways he's making fun of Pnin and all of these kind of unflattering descriptions, also just because Pnin ends up feeling just kind of saintly. So on the last 2 pages of the book, we have this Vladimir guy who's settling into the town and is going to begin working at the college. Hardly had I taken a couple of steps when a great truck carrying beer rumbled up the street, immediately followed by a small, pale blue sedan with the white head of a dog looking out, after which came another giant truck exactly similar to the first. The humble sedan was crammed with bundles and suitcases. Its driver was Pnin. I emitted a roar of greeting, but he did not see me, and my only hope was that I might walk uphill fast enough to catch him, while the red light 1 block ahead kept him at bay. I hurried past the rear truck and had another glimpse of my old friend, intense profile, wearing a cap with ear flaps and a storm coat. But next moment, the light turned green, the little white dog leaning out yapped at Sobakovich, and everything surged forward. Truck 1, Pnin, truck 2. From where I stood, I watched them recede in the frame of the roadway between the Moorish house and the Lombardy poplar. Then the little white sedan boldly swung past the front truck and, free at last, spurted up the shining road, which one could make out narrowing to a thread of gold in the soft mist where hill after hill made beauty of distance, and where there was simply no saying what miracle might happen. So beautiful and so optimistic, but unfortunately, that is not where we end. We, in fact, have this one last couple of paragraphs. And Cockerel is the name of the guy who will be employing our narrator. Cockerel, brown-robed and sandaled, led in the cocker and led me kitchenward to a British breakfast of depressing kidney and fish. And now, he said, I am going to tell you the story of Pnin rising to address the Cremona Women's Club and discovering he had brought the wrong lecture. It's so good. So what an incredible book. Of course, at the end, we are moving all the way back to the beginning. But I really love, in reading that aloud, first of all, reading it aloud is so hard. It makes you realize all of the alliteration and all of the repetition of vowel sounds and these really complicated, like Lombardy Poplar. I had to read that 4 times. He's playing with all of this stuff absolutely on purpose. I did listen to this book at the same time when I was reading it. I like to go back and forth, and it was read by someone who I believe speaks Russian, and it was so great. It was it was really fun to listen to. And now I really have to tip my hat even more to this person now that I've tried to read some of this out loud. And as I was reading it out loud, that last chapter seems a little overblown in terms of the positivity, like this golden road and who knows what miracle might happen. And in some ways, you could look at that as so overblown that there's no way that the satirical narrator thinks that anything good is going to happen. But there's a way that the narrator is trying to catch up to him, and the narrator is trying to make some sort of contact with him. And certainly the way that Pnin is passing by one of the trucks and heading off on his own, there are a lot of really kind of incontrovertibly positive things that are happening at the end here. So on some level, I would love it if it ended with that last note of Pnin, and the idea of miracle, that would be the last word, but that would be so un-Nabokov. So of course we have to have this last word where it is going to send us back to the beginning. And to this man, it turns out that Cockerel is doing all of these really mean-spirited imitations of Pnin. But we have the sense here of our narrator as having changed a little bit. Once Pnin has headed off on his own and might be headed towards some kind of miracle, you have a sense that our narrator is in a much diminished Wayne Dell. He really understands, at this point, Cockerel's imitations of Pnin have worn a little thin and they seem a little mean-spirited. So you do get the sense of our narrator as being kind of left behind in this world that we know doesn't function very well, and that it's not very stimulating, and that the French teachers don't speak French, etc. We have a sense that our narrator is not going to be very content here, and that maybe, just maybe, our Pnin is going to be happy as he is speeding off on that golden road. So that seems like a good place to leave this. I hope this has been interesting. It was so incredibly gratifying to dive back into this novel. It reads so quickly, and I think especially with all of these thoughts in your head, it might just be so delicious. I feel like I haven't even cracked it open because the prose is so rich that you will be just in awe of a given paragraph. So there is so much more to be had. If you're someone who's read this book and has never reread it, you absolutely must, or listen to it. Honestly, it was such a beautiful thing to listen to. So on that note, thank you for tuning in. Happy reading.